The natural gas discoveries offshore of Israel give Israel an incredible opportunity to improve public health, to lower costs of power generation, to improve competitiveness of Israeli manufacturing, increase work productivity through lower pollution rates, and significantly reduce our carbon emissions. However, the geopolitical benefits are quite modest. I'd like to make a few points, general points about geopolitics and the oil and gas trade, and then a few relevant points for Israel. First thing, a little bit about oil. We were raised in the 70s thinking of the oil weapon, thinking of the Arab embargo, and actually oil markets have changed tremendously. There is no such thing as an oil weapon. If there is an oil weapon today, it is actually in the hands of the consumers. You can deny markets to suppliers, to oil suppliers, and actually really crunch them and crunch their economies and their ability. They're the vulnerable countries. But in the case of oil supply, the market is actually, it's a commercial transaction, not between countries, not long-term contracts, very different, as Mr. Chow pointed out, very different from the way that gas operates. And in fact, Israel doesn't have to worry so much about its oil supply. The majority of its oil supply even comes from Azerbaijan, a country that's very friendly to Israel, and that actually oil supply is often comes back to Israel through trade, through export of Israeli goods as well, including arms. Gas trade is much more nuanced, and this is the place where politics comes to play. And it affects it's not only something that the supplier has the political benefit, but often the consumer has the political benefit. Gas trade is different than any other traded good, and I think we have to change the language that we use. It's not a commodity. It's not selling tomatoes. It's not selling cement. It's selling a utility. Utility is something that's a public resource that the public has a right to have access to at an affordable price, and when we think in terms of a utility, it's quite different. Gas is different than almost any other traded good because most of it takes place through permanent infrastructure, whether that's pipelines or even LNG trade does not work like oil trade. The LNG facilities have long-term contracts. The LNG supply boats have long-term consumers, and it's not a market with a lot of flexibility. So to count on that, you could just enter to this very flexible market in gas, it's quite different. And in fact, in gas trade relationships, in terms of a big part of the rhetoric in Israel has been, well, maybe we won't even need enough gas here for the domestic market, or who knows what will be in the future, but we will become a geopolitical power if we export the gas. And actually, when you study this in a more nuanced way, you understand that first thing, in most cases, the gas trade is just trade. It's a small part of the export of a certain supplier. It might be the small part of the energy imported by a certain country, and may have very little geopolitical significance. But when you look even more with higher volumes of trade, you find that it's not, in many cases, it's actually the supplier that becomes dependent on the market and not the market dependent on the supplier. So when you think of the gas weapon and the geopolitical value, you have to also think of the vulnerability of your market. If, for instance, 10% of your GNP comes from, for instance, gas that's transited through Turkey or Greece, who's dependent on who? Is it the supplier, or is it the market that has the power? Again, like we see it in oil. And in fact, we should be very careful about using the words interdependence, because the gas relationships, it could be, as I said, just trade, or it could be dependence of one side. The fact that one side needs the market or one side needs the gas doesn't mean they're interdependent. And even in cases that look like they're interdependent, we often find it doesn't bring to any sort of geopolitical value. For instance, in the case where Egyptian gas was very important to the Israeli market, did the cessation of supplies change Israeli policies? Did we see settlements suddenly dismantled, or any sort of meaning to the change in the supplies? So it's a very raw weapon. And in the case of Egypt, we could maybe in the Q&A we could discuss it. I think this was purely economical, that Egypt simply does not produce enough gas and just use the political contest as an excuse. But even in the cases where the gas was really used as a political weapon, as the case of, for instance, Russia with Georgia, Russia and Ukraine, it did not achieve its desired results by Moscow. So we should be very cautious that there are few cases of interdependency, and what we have even no cases in the international system is peace pipelines. We don't have any case where countries have given up concessions on land water, a type of government they have, because they wanted access to oil and gas. And I've studied this around the world, Russia, Japan, a number of cases where markets were so ripe for each other, and yet that didn't bring to territorial compromise. It didn't bring to peace. So we should not be looking for for peace pipelines in any sense. Where the geopolitical value can be found, it's actually not in terms of the weapon of coercion, or not in terms of how you can whip your markets into some sort of shaping their policies, but actually if our neighborhood of the Middle East is a very strange part of the world. It's one of the only parts of the world where oil is still the primary fuel for electricity production. So what that means is that most of our neighbors, and up until thank you for Gidon for leading and finding Yam Tetis and bringing the gas to Israel. The majority of Israel's electricity was also produced by oil. This means that electricity in our part of the world is very expensive, very polluting, and therefore most of our neighbors actually have huge regular disruptions of electricity. Lebanon maybe gets 8 hours a day. Syria prior to the crisis had maybe 12 hours a day. Jordan has about 12 hours a day at best of electricity. You can't have economic progress if you don't have regular electricity supply. So the gas could be very useful in our neighbors for allowing them to have regular electricity supply, which could help them improve their economies. And Israel has an interest of living next to prosperous and stable states. The gas can also get rid of water conflicts in the region. You know, these conferences, the water conflicts used to be the buzzword. If you have natural gas, if you have a cheap, clean source of fuel, you can produce water, and you don't need to have conflicts over water. There could be enough water for the region. Another thing is that it's in Israel's interest, from a purely public health interest, that we have an interest in how our neighbors produce electricity. Pollution doesn't stop at checkpoints. When garbage is burned in Ramallah, the children in Modin breathe it. When electricity is produced on diesel in Gaza, the children of Ashkelon breathe it. So we have an interest that our neighbors produce electricity in a clean way, and the natural gas allows this. I'll just make one last point on energy security policies and the political role, is that market forces alone do not provide energy security. And we see this even in the places where we like to emulate. First thing, you can't really take an example from the United States that has 1,000 gas producers, that no more of them has more than 3% of the market, and has about 400 buyers in Northeast United States. That would be anything similar to the Israeli market, that will probably have two suppliers that are more or less a different legal version of the same entity, and one buyer, which is the Israel Electric Corporation. And to think that competition is going to bring the energy security to Israel, I think it's a myth, and it won't happen. Thank you.